There was a boy who had mastered something most people never even try to learn. He knew exactly how to disappear without leaving the room. Not in some magic trick kind of way, but in a much sadder, more real way. He could sit in a classroom full of 30 students and somehow make sure nobody ever really saw him. His name was David, and he was 16 years old. Every morning he'd walk through the front doors of Roosevelt High School with his head down, earbuds in, wearing the same oversized gray hoodie that had seen better days. The hoodie was his armor. It was big enough that he could kind of shrink into it, pull the hood up and just blend into the background like he was part of the furniture. David always sat in the back left corner of every classroom. Not the very back row where the troublemakers sat because that got attention, and not the middle where teachers like to pick on students who seemed to be daydreaming. No, he sat in that sweet spot where teachers' eyes just seemed to skip right over. That magical place where you're present enough not to be marked absent, but invisible enough never to be called on. He'd perfected this over years. The slight slouch that made him look smaller, the way he'd flip open his notebook right when the teacher scanned the room for someone to answer a question. The timing of looking down at exactly the right moment. Sometimes he'd even pretend to write, his pen moving across the paper, filling it with random doodles and half-thoughts. Anything to look busy. Lunch was the hardest part of the day. The cafeteria was loud and chaotic, full of friend groups and inside jokes and people who belonged somewhere. David would grab whatever looked fastest to eat, usually a sandwich or some fruit, and then he'd disappear to the library. The librarian, an older woman who'd been there forever, never said much. She'd just nod when he came in, and he'd find his usual spot in the far corner behind the reference books nobody ever used. He'd eat quickly, then pull out whatever book he'd checked out that week. Books were his escape. In a book he could be anyone, anywhere. He could be brave, important, seen. The characters in books had friends who cared about them, families who showed up, futures that seemed bright. Real life wasn't like that, at least not for him. Home wasn't much better than school. His mom worked 3 jobs just to keep their small apartment. She'd leave before he woke up and come home after he'd gone to bed most nights. He'd find notes on the kitchen counter sometimes. Money for food on the table. "Love you, Mom." He knew she was trying her best, doing what she had to do, but it didn't make the apartment feel any less empty. His dad had left when David was 7. He barely remembered the guy now. Just vague impressions of a tall man who smelled like cigarettes and was always angry about something. After he left, it was just David and his mom. And then it became David alone most of the time while his mom worked herself to exhaustion trying to pay the bills. At school, the other kids didn't bully him. That would require them to notice him. They just looked right through him like he was made of glass. He'd be standing at his locker and someone would reach right across him to talk to their friend without even acknowledging he was there. He'd be walking down the hallway and people would bump into him without apologizing, like he was just another obstacle to navigate around. David told himself he liked it this way. He'd convinced himself that being invisible was safer than being seen. If nobody noticed you, nobody could hurt you. Nobody could make fun of your worn-out shoes or the fact that you wore the same 3 shirts in rotation. Nobody could ask why you never had money for school trips or why your mom never showed up to parent-teacher conferences. But late at night, lying in his bed in that quiet apartment, David would stare at the ceiling and wonder what it would feel like to matter to someone. What would it be like to have a friend text you just to see how you're doing? What would it be like to have a teacher remember your name? What would it be like to walk into a room and have someone's face light up because you were there? He'd push those thoughts away quickly, though. Wanting things you couldn't have was dangerous. It made you soft, made you hope for things that weren't going to happen. It was better to just accept reality. He was invisible, and that was that. His grades were carefully calculated to be average. Not so low that counselors would call him in for meetings about his potential. Not so high that teachers would expect things from him or push him to do more. He floated right in that middle zone, getting C's and occasional B's, doing just enough to pass but never enough to stand out. The thing about being invisible for so long is that you start to forget what it feels like to be seen. David had been doing this since middle school, maybe even before, year after year of making himself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. It became automatic, like breathing. He didn't even have to think about it anymore. Sometimes he'd see other kids his age laughing with their friends, making plans for the weekend, and he'd feel this weird ache in his chest. But he'd learned to ignore that too. Feelings were just another thing to push down and away. Keep your head down, get through the day, go home, repeat. His teachers barely knew he existed. In his English class, the teacher had called him Daniel for the first 2 months of school before someone corrected her. She'd apologized, but David had just shrugged. It didn't really matter. Names were for people who mattered. There was one thing David did that nobody knew about. He wrote. Not for school, not for anyone else, just for himself. He had a notebook hidden under his mattress filled with stories and thoughts and feelings he'd never say out loud. In those pages, he could be honest. He could admit that he was lonely, that he wished things were different, that sometimes he felt like he was screaming inside but nobody could hear him. The notebook was his secret, his one real thing in a life that felt increasingly unreal. Sometimes he'd write about what he imagined his life could be like. A life where he had friends, where his mom was home for dinner, where teachers knew his name and actually cared about whether he learned anything. It felt silly when he wrote it, like he was a little kid wishing for something impossible. But David kept writing anyway, filling page after page with words nobody would ever read. It was the one place where he existed fully, where he wasn't trying to disappear. On those pages he was real, he was seen, even if it was only by himself. He figured this was just how his life would be. Get through high school, maybe get some kind of job, keep his head down, stay invisible. It wasn't the life he'd dreamed of when he was younger, but dreams were for other people. People who had support systems and opportunities and someone who believed in them. David had none of those things. So he did what he'd always done. He made himself smaller, quieter, less visible. He perfected the art of taking up as little space as possible in the world. He convinced himself that this was fine, that he'd chosen this, that he was okay with being the ghost in the back of the classroom. But deep down, in a place he tried not to look at too closely, David was waiting. Waiting for something to change, waiting for someone to see him. Waiting for a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was worth noticing after all. He just didn't know that everything was about to change, that someone was about to look at him and actually see who he was, that his whole world was about to shift in ways he couldn't possibly imagine. But that story was still waiting to begin. For now, David was just another invisible kid in the back of the classroom, convinced that nobody would ever really see him. Everything changed on a cold Tuesday morning in November, when their regular English teacher, Mr. Peterson, announced he was retiring early for health reasons. The students barely reacted. Mr. Peterson had been teaching for 35 years and mostly just read from the textbook while sitting at his desk. Most kids did homework for other classes during his lessons. The substitute they got first was a disaster. She showed movies and didn't bother learning anyone's name. But 3 weeks later, the principal announced they'd found a permanent replacement. Her name was Mrs. Rivera, and she was young, maybe late 20s, with an energy that seemed completely out of place at Roosevelt High. The first day she walked into the classroom, David noticed something different right away. Most teachers entered and immediately went to their desk or the whiteboard. Mrs. Rivera walked in, set her bag down, and then walked around the entire room, making eye contact with every single student. When her eyes landed on David in his back corner, she didn't just glance and move on. She looked at him, really looked at him, and smiled. Not a fake teacher smile, but a real one that reached her eyes. He looked away quickly, confused and a little nervous. Nobody looked at him like that, like he was actually there. Mrs. Rivera didn't teach like Mr. Peterson. She didn't sit at her desk or just read from the book. She moved around the room constantly, asking questions, actually listening to answers, making the stories they read feel alive and important. She'd perch on the edge of desks, gesture wildly when she got excited about a particular passage, and treated every student's opinion like it actually mattered. At first, David kept his head down like always. He had his strategies, his ways of staying invisible. But Mrs. Rivera didn't play by the usual rules. She'd walk past his desk and casually drop off a handout, making brief comments like, "I think you'll find this part interesting," or "Pay attention to the third paragraph. There's something good there." He didn't know what to do with that. Teachers didn't talk to him. They didn't think about what he might find interesting. About 2 weeks into her teaching, Mrs. Rivera was discussing The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. Most of the class was half asleep or on their phones, but David was actually paying attention. The book was about kids who didn't fit in, who felt like the world had already decided who they were before giving them a chance. He understood that in a way that made his chest feel tight. Mrs. Rivera was talking about Ponyboy, the main character, and how he felt invisible to the rest of the world. He's there living his life, but society looks right through him, like he doesn't matter because of where he comes from. She paused, scanning the room. Have any of you ever felt like that? Like people see what they expect to see instead of who you really are? The room was quiet. Nobody ever answered questions like that. They were too real, too personal. Then Mrs. Rivera's eyes landed on David. What do you think? She asked gently. Do you think Ponyboy chooses to be invisible, or is it forced on him? David's heart jumped into his throat. Everyone was looking at him now. He could feel their eyes. His first instinct was to mumble something, anything, just to make it stop. But something about the way Mrs. Rivera was looking at him, patient and genuinely curious, made him actually think about the question. Both, he said quietly. Then, because she was still looking at him, waiting for more, he continued. Like, at first people treat him like he's nothing, so he starts acting like it. But then it becomes easier to just be invisible than to fight it. The room was silent for a moment. Mrs. Rivera's face broke into a huge smile. Exactly. That's exactly it. Thank you, David. She turned to write something on the board, and the moment passed, but David sat there stunned. She knew his name. She'd used his name without hesitation, without checking a seating chart, and she'd treated his answer like it was smart, like it mattered. After class, as everyone filed out, Mrs. Rivera called out, David, can you hang back for a second? His stomach dropped. He'd spoken up, and now he was in trouble somehow. That's what happened when you got noticed. He waited by the door, gripping his backpack straps. Mrs. Rivera walked over with a small book in her hand. Have you read this? She held up a worn copy of The Perks of Being a Wallflower. David shook his head. I think you might like it. The main character, Charlie, he reminds me a little of Ponyboy, and maybe a little of you. She held the book out. It's my personal copy, so take care of it. But I'd love to hear what you think when you're done. David took the book, confused. Teachers didn't lend students their personal books. Why? He asked before he could stop himself. Mrs. Rivera tilted her head. Why what? Why do you care what I think? Something sad flickered across her face. Because you're clearly someone who thinks deeply about things. I saw you during class, the way you were really listening. Most students just zone out, but you were engaged. That's rare, David, that matters. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and left. But that night, instead of doing his usual routine of zoning out in front of the TV with whatever frozen dinner he could find, David opened the book. He read it in 2 days, barely able to put it down. The next week, Mrs. Rivera started a new routine. She'd walk around during independent reading time, and when she got to David's desk, she'd crouch down and they'd have these quiet, brief conversations about whatever he was reading. She never made a big deal of it, never called attention to it in front of the other students. It was just between them. She asked him questions nobody had ever asked him before. Not just about the books, but about what he thought, what he noticed, what patterns he saw. She treated him like his opinions were valuable, like his mind was something worth engaging with. One day, about a month into her teaching, Mrs. Rivera handed back essays they'd written. David had done his usual thing, writing just enough to get a decent grade without standing out. But when he looked at his paper, there was a note at the bottom in her handwriting. You're holding back. I can tell there's more you want to say. Next time, let yourself say it. I promise it's safe. That note did something to him. It cracked something open that he'd been keeping carefully locked away. Someone had noticed, not just that he existed, but that he was hiding, protecting himself, and instead of letting it go, she was calling him out on it gently but firmly. The next assignment was a personal narrative. Most students groaned, but David felt this weird mix of fear and excitement. Mrs. Rivera had told him it was safe. Could he actually believe that? He started writing and couldn't stop. He wrote about what it felt like to be invisible, to walk through life like a ghost, to wonder if anyone would notice if you just didn't show up one day. He wrote about his mom working 3 jobs, about eating dinner alone every night, about the library corner where he hid during lunch. He wrote 4 pages when the assignment only required 2. When he turned it in, his hands were shaking. He'd exposed himself in a way he'd never done before. What if she laughed? What if she pitied him? What if she read it out loud to the class as an example of what not to do? 3 days later, she handed the essays back. David almost didn't want to look at his, but when he finally did, there was no grade at the top. Instead, there was a note. Please see me after class. His heart sank. He'd gone too far, been too honest. He'd made a mistake. After everyone left, he approached her desk slowly. Mrs. Rivera was looking at him with this expression he couldn't quite read. "David, can I be honest with you?" He nodded, bracing himself. "This is one of the best pieces of writing I've ever read from a high school student. The honesty, the emotion, the way you use details to make your experience real. It's powerful. Really powerful." David stared at her. "What? You have a gift?" "I don't say that lightly. You're a writer, David, a real one." She paused. "But more than that, I'm worried about you. The things you wrote about, feeling invisible, feeling alone. Are you okay?" Nobody had asked him that before. Not in a way that felt like they actually wanted to know the answer. He felt his throat get tight. "I'm fine. I don't believe you," she said gently. "And that's okay. You don't have to be fine. But I want you to know something. You're not invisible to me. I see you. I see how smart you are, how much you feel, how much potential you have, and I'm not going anywhere." David felt something wet on his cheek and realized he was crying. He hadn't cried in years. He'd taught himself not to. But standing there in that empty classroom with this teacher who barely knew him saying these things, something broke open. Mrs. Rivera grabbed a tissue box and handed it to him. She didn't make a big deal of his tears, didn't get uncomfortable. She just waited. "I don't understand why you care," he finally said. "Because that's what teachers are supposed to do, really see their students, really care about who they are and who they could become." She pulled out a brand new journal, the kind with a leather cover that looked expensive. "I want you to have this. Write in it. Every day if you can. Write about anything. Your thoughts, your feelings, stories, poems, whatever comes out. You don't have to show it to anyone. But I think you need a place to put all the things you're carrying around." David took the journal, running his hand over the smooth cover. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything. Just promise me you'll keep writing, and promise me you'll start showing up for yourself the way you show up in your writing. Deal?" He nodded, clutching the journal. As he left the classroom that day, David felt different. Lighter somehow. For the first time in years, someone had really seen him. Not just noticed him in passing, but actually seen who he was underneath all the carefully constructed invisibility. He didn't know it yet, but that moment was the beginning of everything changing. The ghost in the back of the classroom was starting to become real. David carried that journal home like it was something precious and fragile. He set it on his desk and just stared at it for a long time. The leather cover caught the light from his small desk lamp, looking almost like it was glowing. It was the nicest thing anyone had given him in years, maybe ever. For 3 days, he didn't write in it. He was afraid to mess it up, to put something stupid on those perfect blank pages. What if what he wrote wasn't good enough? What if Mrs. Rivera had made a mistake and he wasn't actually a good writer at all? But on the 4th night, after microwaving another frozen dinner and eating it alone in the quiet apartment, David picked up a pen. His hand hovered over the first page. Then he started writing. He wrote about his day, but not the boring facts of it. He wrote about how it felt to walk through the hallways watching everyone else have friends and inside jokes. He wrote about the weird ache in his chest when he saw other kids getting picked up after school by parents who asked how their day was. He wrote about his mom and how he loved her but also felt angry at her for never being there, and then felt guilty for feeling angry. The words poured out like water from a broken dam. He filled 5 pages that first night, his hand cramping, but he couldn't stop. It felt like something that had been building up inside him for years was finally finding a way out. When he finally set the pen down, it was past midnight. He felt exhausted but also lighter, like he'd put down something heavy he'd been carrying. He read back over what he'd written, expecting it to be garbage. But it wasn't. It was real and raw and true. The next day at school, David found himself actually looking forward to English class. Mrs. Rivera had started doing these writing exercises at the beginning of each period. Just 10 minutes of free writing on whatever prompt she gave. Most students complained, but David bent over his desk and wrote furiously every time. Mrs. Rivera would walk around during these exercises, reading over shoulders. David used to tense up when she approached, but now he found himself almost hoping she'd read what he wrote. And she did, regularly pausing at his desk, sometimes nodding, sometimes smiling, once even giving him a thumbs up. After 2 weeks, She asked if she could read something from his free writing out loud to the class without using his name. His heart jumped, but he nodded. She read a piece he'd written about winter mornings. About walking to school when it's still dark and your breath makes clouds in the cold air. About feeling like you're the only person awake in the world. When she finished, the room was quiet for a second. Then a girl named Jessica said, "Wow, that was actually really good. Who wrote it?" Mrs. Rivera just smiled. "Someone who pays attention to the world." She caught David's eye and winked. Something shifted in him that day. His words had affected someone, made them feel something. That piece of himself that he'd put on paper had reached out and touched another person. It was powerful in a way he'd never experienced before. At home that night, David pulled out the journal again. But this time he didn't write about his day or his feelings. He wrote a story. It was about a kid who could turn invisible for real, not just metaphorically. And the story was about whether that power was a gift or a curse. He stayed up until 2 in the morning working on it, lost in the world he was creating. When he finally finished, he had 8 pages of story. He read it over, making corrections, changing words, tightening sentences. It wasn't perfect, but it was good. He knew it was good. The next day, he did something that would have been unthinkable a month ago. He stayed after class and asked Mrs. Rivera if she'd read his story. Her face lit up. "I'd love to. Can I take it home and give you feedback tomorrow?" David nodded, feeling vulnerable but also brave. He was choosing to be seen, and it was terrifying and exciting at the same time. The next day, Mrs. Rivera handed the story back with notes in the margins. Not corrections, but comments. "This image is powerful. I didn't see this twist coming. The emotion here is perfect." At the end, she'd written a full paragraph about what she liked and some suggestions for making it even stronger. "David, this is really good," she said when he lingered after class. "Have you thought about submitting to the school literary magazine?" He shook his head. "Nobody would want to read my stuff." "That's where you're wrong. People would definitely want to read this. In fact, I know the faculty advisor for the magazine. Would you be okay if I passed your story along?" Terror and hope battled in his chest. "I guess so," he said, trying to sound casual even though his heart was racing. A week later, Mrs. Rivera told him the magazine wanted to publish his story. They wanted to feature it on the first page of the next issue. David couldn't believe it. His words, his story, printed and bound and read by people all over school. When the magazine came out, David held it in his hands like it was made of gold. There was his story, The Invisible Boy, with his name right there under the title, David Chen, in print. Real. He'd been so focused on the story that he hadn't thought about what would happen after. Kids he'd never spoken to came up to him in the hallway. "Hey, are you the one who wrote that story in the magazine?" "Dude, that was really good. Made me think about some stuff." It was overwhelming. Part of him wanted to shrink back into his hoodie and disappear. But another part, a growing part, felt something new. Pride. Accomplishment. The sense that maybe he did have something valuable to offer the world. Mrs. Rivera noticed the change in him. In class, he started participating more. Not all the time, not enough to be annoying, but when he had something to say, he said it. His comments were thoughtful, and other students started actually listening when he spoke. At lunch, he still went to the library, but now he sat at one of the main tables instead of hiding in the back corner. He still read and wrote, but he was visible now, present. Sometimes other kids would sit at his table, and slowly, carefully, he started having conversations. Nothing deep, just small talk about homework or books or whatever, but it was more social interaction than he'd had in years. His grades started improving too, not just in English. When you stop spending all your energy trying to be invisible, you have more energy for everything else. He started actually caring about what he learned in his other classes. Started doing more than the minimum. His mom noticed something was different. She worked weekends, but on Sunday mornings when she was home, she asked him how school was going. Usually he just said fine, but this time he told her about the story in the magazine. He showed it to her. She read it right there at the kitchen table, still in her work uniform, her eyes moving across the pages. When she finished, she had tears in her eyes. "Baby, this is beautiful. When did you learn to write like this?" "I've been writing for a while," he said quietly. "Just never showed anyone before." She pulled him into a hug, and he couldn't remember the last time that had happened. "I'm sorry I haven't been around more. I'm sorry I didn't know you could do this." "It's okay, Mom, you're working hard. I get it. No, it's not okay. I've been so focused on keeping us afloat that I haven't really seen you. Your teacher, Mrs. Rivera, she saw you. She saw something in you that I should have seen. David felt his throat get tight. You're doing your best. I'm going to do better. I promise. She pulled back and looked at him. I'm proud of you. So proud. That conversation stayed with David. His mom started leaving him longer notes asking about his day, about his writing. She couldn't be home more often. The bills still needed to be paid, but she was trying to be more present in the ways she could. At school, Mrs. Rivera kept pushing him. She introduced him to different authors, different styles of writing. She challenged him to try poetry, which he resisted at first but then fell in love with. She told him about writing contests and encouraged him to enter. 2 months after the magazine published his story, Mrs. Rivera pulled him aside after class with news. She'd submitted one of his poems to a regional high school writing competition. He'd won second place. The prize was $500 and publication in an anthology. David couldn't process it. $500 was real money. Money that could help his mom with bills. Money that proved his writing had actual value. I should have asked before submitting, Mrs. Rivera said. But I really believed in this piece, and I wanted you to see that other people would too. Are you upset? No, David said, his voice shaking. No, I can't believe this, and believe it. You earned this. Your words, your talent, your hard work. This is just the beginning, David. The award ceremony was on a Saturday. David's mom took the day off, which meant losing money, but she insisted. She dressed up, and they drove to the university where the ceremony was held. David had to read his winning poem on stage in front of hundreds of people. His hands shook as he stood at the podium. The lights were bright, and he couldn't really see the audience, which maybe made it easier. He started reading, his voice quiet at first, then growing stronger as the words took over. The poem was about being invisible, about feeling like a ghost in your own life. But it was also about learning to be seen, about finding your voice, about the people who help you realize you were never really invisible at all, just waiting to be noticed. When he finished, the applause was thunderous. He looked into the audience and found his mom, tears streaming down her face, clapping so hard. Next to her was Mrs. Rivera on her feet, beaming at him with this look of pure pride. In that moment, standing on that stage with his words still hanging in the air, David realized something. He wasn't invisible anymore. He'd found his voice and people were listening. More importantly, he'd found himself. The version of himself that had been hiding behind the gray hoodie, the slouched shoulders, the carefully cultivated invisibility. That version of him was still there. The quiet kid who preferred books to crowds, who felt things deeply and sometimes struggled to express them. But now that kid had a way to be seen without having to completely change who he was. Writing was his bridge between the quiet internal world and the loud external one. After the ceremony, Mrs. Rivera pulled him aside. I have something for you. She handed him a box wrapped in simple brown paper. Inside was a laptop. Not a new one, but not old either. It's mine from a few years ago, she explained. I upgraded, and this one's just been sitting around. Every writer needs a good keyboard to work on. Consider it an investment in your future. David didn't know what to say. The journal, the encouragement, the opportunities, and now this. Why are you doing all this for me? Mrs. Rivera smiled. Because I was you once. I was the quiet kid in the back who felt invisible. And someone saw me and believed in me. And it changed my entire life. I became a teacher so I could do the same for other kids. You're talented, David. But more than that, you're worth the investment. You matter. David felt that familiar tightness in his throat, but this time he didn't try to hide it. Thank you. For everything. For seeing me. You were always there to be seen. You just needed someone to look. The laptop changed everything. David set it up on his small desk at home and spent hours teaching himself to type properly. His 2-finger hunt and peck method wasn't going to cut it anymore. He downloaded a free typing program and practiced every night after finishing his homework. Within weeks, he could type almost as fast as he could think. The words flowed from his mind through his fingers onto the screen in a way that felt magical. He started writing more, longer pieces, experimenting with different styles and voices. The journal Mrs. Rivera had given him was nearly full now, but he kept it for handwritten drafts and ideas. The laptop was for finished pieces. At school, things continued to shift in ways David hadn't expected. After winning the writing competition, A few students from the literary magazine approached him about joining their club. He'd never been part of any club or group. The idea terrified him, but it also pulled at something inside him. A desire to belong somewhere. The first meeting he attended, he sat in the back of the classroom, falling into old habits. But the club president, a senior named Ryan, immediately called him out.
Hey, David Chen, right?
The guy who wrote The Invisible Boy? Come sit up here. We've been waiting for you. David moved to the front, his face burning. There were about 12 other students, all of them looking at him with interest rather than judgment. They weren't the popular kids or the ones who had everything figured out. They were the readers, the writers, the artists, the ones who felt things deeply and tried to capture it in words. For the first time in his life, David felt like he'd found his people. They met twice a week after school. They'd share what they were working on, give each other feedback, argue about whether poetry needed to rhyme, discuss their favorite books and authors. David started looking forward to these meetings more than anything else in his week. One day, Ryan asked David to be the poetry editor for the next issue of the magazine. You've got an eye for it, Ryan said. Plus, you're good at giving feedback that's honest but not mean. That's rare. David accepted, feeling a mix of pride and imposter syndrome. Him, an editor, but he threw himself into the role, reading submissions carefully, writing thoughtful notes, helping other students improve their work. He discovered he was good at it. Good at seeing what someone was trying to say and helping them say it better. His friendship with Ryan grew. Ryan was going to college next year to study journalism, and he talked about it constantly, his excitement contagious. He asked David what his plans were after high school. David had never really thought about college. It seemed like something for other people, people with money and support and clear paths forward. I don't know, he admitted. Probably just get a job or something. Ryan looked at him like he was crazy. Dude, you're one of the best writers in this school. You need to go to college. Study creative writing or journalism or literature. You could get scholarships with your talent. The idea planted itself in David's mind like a seed. Could he actually do that? Go to college? Study writing? It seemed impossible, but also maybe not completely impossible. He talked to Mrs. Rivera about it the next day. She'd been waiting for this conversation. I've already been looking into scholarship programs for you, she said, pulling out a folder. There are several specifically for students who show exceptional promise in writing. And there are need-based scholarships too. Your financial situation actually helps in that regard. She'd done research. For him, had spent her own time looking up opportunities because she believed in him. David felt that familiar tightness in his throat. Over the next few months, Mrs. Rivera became part guidance counselor, part college coach, part cheerleader. She helped him prepare for the SAT, worked with him on college essays, connected him with the school counselor who could help with financial aid paperwork. She never made him feel like a charity case. She made him feel like a student worth investing in. David's grades had climbed to mostly A's and B's. Not because school suddenly became easy, but because he started caring. When you believe you have a future, present work matters more. His reputation at school continued to evolve. He wasn't popular in the traditional sense, would never be the kid everyone knew and wanted to be friends with, but he'd become known for something. That's David, he's a really good writer. He's the poetry editor for the magazine. He won that big writing contest. People saw him now. Really saw him. And the strange thing was, it wasn't as scary as he'd thought it would be. Being invisible had felt safe, but it had also felt lonely and small. Being seen was scary sometimes, but it also felt real. It felt like living instead of just existing. The spring of his junior year, the school announced their annual art showcase. Students could perform, display art, read their work, whatever they wanted. Mrs. Rivera immediately nominated David to read one of his pieces. No way, David said. That's different from the competition. That was at a university. This is school. Everyone I know will be there. Exactly, Mrs. Rivera said. This is your community. They should hear your voice. He resisted for weeks, but she was persistent. Finally, he agreed to do it, but on one condition. He'd write something new specifically for the showcase, something that said what he needed to say. He worked on that piece for 3 weeks, writing and rewriting, crafting every line until it said exactly what he meant. It was about transformation, about moving from invisible to visible, about the people who see us when we can't see ourselves, about finding courage when you've spent years convincing yourself you don't have any. The night of the showcase, the auditorium was packed. Parents, students, teachers, everyone there to support the performers. David paced backstage, his printed pages shaking in his hands. He could hear the crowd, the murmur of hundreds of voices. "You're going to be amazing," Ryan said, clapping him on the shoulder. "Trust yourself." When his name was called, David walked onto that stage on legs that felt like water. The lights were bright, just like at the competition. He found his mom in the third row, and next to her, Mrs. Rivera, both of them smiling at him, believing in him. He took a breath and started reading. His voice shook at first, but as the words took over, as he fell into the rhythm of what he'd written, his voice steadied and grew stronger. He'd written about being the invisible boy in the back corner, about the gray hoodie and the lunch period in the library, about feeling like nobody would notice if he disappeared. But then the piece shifted. He wrote about a teacher who looked closer, who saw past the carefully constructed walls, who believed in a quiet kid when he didn't believe in himself. He wrote about finding his voice through writing, about learning that being seen wasn't something to fear but something to embrace. He wrote about transformation, not as a complete change but as a becoming more fully yourself, the version of yourself you were always meant to be. The auditorium was silent as he read. You could feel the attention, the way everyone was really listening. When he reached the final lines, his voice was clear and strong. "I thought I was invisible, that invisibility was safety. But I was wrong. I was never invisible. I was just waiting for someone to teach me how to be seen. And now I know the bravest thing you can do is let yourself be fully known." The silence held for 1 heartbeat. 2. Then the auditorium erupted in applause. Not polite applause, but the kind that made you feel it in your chest. People were standing, clapping, some even cheering. David looked out at the crowd, at all these people who had just heard his truth, who had responded to it. He found his mom, tears streaming down her face, clapping so hard. Mrs. Rivera was standing too, one hand over her heart, her eyes shining. Backstage afterward, David was surrounded by people. Classmates he barely knew telling him how much the piece meant to them, how they'd felt invisible too. Teachers congratulating him. Parents of other students introducing themselves, saying their kids talked about his writing. It was overwhelming in the best way. He felt seen but not exposed, visible but not vulnerable. He'd shared something deeply personal, and instead of it making him feel weak, it made him feel powerful. His mom found him in the crowd and pulled him into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you. So proud. You're going to do amazing things, baby. I know it." Mrs. Rivera waited until the crowd thinned before approaching. "That was extraordinary, David. I knew you had it in you, but that exceeded every expectation. You moved people tonight, really moved them." "I couldn't have done any of this without you," David said. "You changed my life." "No," Mrs. Rivera said firmly. "I just helped you see what was already there. You changed your own life. You did the work, took the risks, found the courage. I just provided some opportunities." That night, David couldn't sleep. He lay in his bed replaying the evening. The applause, the faces in the crowd, the feeling of his words reaching people and meaning something. A year ago, he'd been invisible, convinced that's how he'd always be. And now he'd stood on a stage in front of hundreds of people and shared his truth. He got up and opened his laptop. He had college essays to write, scholarships to apply for, a future to build. The invisible boy in the gray hoodie still existed somewhere inside him. But now there was also this other version. The writer, the poet, the kid who'd found his voice and learned to use it. He started typing and the words flowed easily now. They always did. He wrote about his journey, about transformation and possibility and the power of being seen. He wrote about teachers who changed lives and students who learned to change their own. He wrote late into the night, the apartment quiet around him, except for the soft clicking of the keyboard. Outside his window, the city lights glowed, and somewhere out there was a future he'd never imagined could be his. But now he could see it clearly. College, studying writing, maybe teaching someday like Mrs. Rivera, helping other invisible kids find their voices. The path wasn't fully formed yet, but it existed. It was real. And he was walking toward it, visible and unafraid. David's senior year felt like living in a different reality from the one he'd known just 2 years before. He'd become one of the editors-in-chief of the literary magazine alongside Ryan's replacement, a girl named Taylor, who wrote science fiction. They worked together to make the magazine better than it had ever been, publishing 3 issues instead of the usual 2, even creating an online version. The college applications had been brutal. Hours of essays, financial aid forms that seemed designed to be confusing, test prep, and constant anxiety. But Mrs. Rivera had been there for every step, reading his essays, helping him navigate the paperwork, calming him down when the stress felt overwhelming. In March, the acceptance letters started arriving. David got into the state university with a partial scholarship, then a better scholarship from another school, then a full ride to a small liberal arts college known for its writing program, full tuition, room and board, books, everything covered. When he opened that letter, sitting at the kitchen table with his mom watching nervously, he had to read it 3 times before the words made sense. Full scholarship, 4 years, everything paid for. His mom burst into tears. Real messy, happy tears. She grabbed the letter and read it herself like she needed to confirm it was real. "Baby, you did it! You're going to college. You're really going to college." David felt like he was floating. This was real. This was happening. The invisible kid from the back corner was going to college on a full scholarship to study writing. It seemed impossible, but there it was in black and white, official letterhead and everything. At school the next day, he showed Mrs. Rivera. She read the letter, and her eyes filled with tears too. "I knew it," she said. "I knew someone would see your potential and invest in it. I'm so proud of you, David. So incredibly proud." "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. "You know that, right? None of this would have happened if you hadn't seen me." "You would have found your way eventually," she said. "Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe the path would have been harder. But you have something special, and special has a way of showing itself. I just helped speed up the process." Graduation came in June. David wore his cap and gown, sat with his class, walked across that stage when they called his name. His mom was in the audience, and so was Mrs. Rivera. He'd graduated with honors, a 3.7 GPA, so different from the C student he'd been just 2 years ago. At the graduation party the school threw, David found himself surrounded by friends from the literary magazine, people from his classes, even some teachers who wanted to congratulate him. It was surreal. He'd spent so many years trying not to be noticed, and now people were seeking him out, celebrating him. Before he left the party, he found Mrs. Rivera one more time. "I got you something," he said, handing her a wrapped package. Inside was a leather-bound journal exactly like the one she'd given him, but new. On the first page he'd written, "For Mrs. Rivera, who taught me that being seen is not something to fear, but something to embrace. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for everything. Your student forever, David Chen." She pressed the journal to her chest, tears in her eyes again. "I'm going to miss you so much. I'll visit," he promised. "And I'll write to you. Actual letters, not just emails." "You better," she said, pulling him into a hug. "And David, when you're at college, keep writing. Keep sharing your voice. The world needs to hear what you have to say." That summer passed in a strange haze. David worked part-time at a bookstore, saved money for college expenses not covered by his scholarship, and wrote constantly. He'd started working on something bigger than poems or short stories. A novel, maybe. Or a memoir. He wasn't sure yet. But it was about being invisible, about transformation, about finding yourself when you'd been lost for so long. In August, his mom drove him to college. It was a 3-hour drive to the small campus tucked away in the hills. The school was beautiful, old brick buildings and tree-lined paths. Nothing like the concrete and asphalt of Roosevelt High. His mom helped him move into his dorm room, a small space he'd share with a roommate from Chicago who seemed nice. When it was time for her to leave, she hugged him tight. "I'm sorry I wasn't around more when you were growing up. I'm sorry I missed so much. Mom, you did what you had to do. We survived. We made it. More than survived. Look at you. Look at what you've become." She pulled back and looked at him. "Call me every week, okay? Let me know how you're doing. I want to be part of this. I will. I promise." After she left, David stood in his empty dorm room looking out the window at the campus below. Students were everywhere, moving in, saying goodbye to parents, starting their new lives. He was one of them now. A college student. A writer with a future college was everything and nothing like he'd expected. The classes were hard, but he loved them. His professors actually cared about what he had to say, pushed him to think deeper, write better. He joined the campus literary magazine, started attending poetry readings, made friends with other writers who understood him. He kept his promise to Mrs. Rivera, writing her letters every month. Real letters, handwritten on nice paper. He told her about his classes, his writing, the things he was learning. She wrote back every time, sharing updates from Roosevelt High, telling him she was proud of him, encouraging him to keep going. 4 years passed. David wrote constantly, growing as a writer, finding his voice more fully. He published poems in small magazines, won a few more competitions, started working on his memoir seriously. He studied education alongside creative writing, thinking more and more about teaching. When graduation came, Mrs. Rivera drove 3 hours to attend. She sat in the audience with David's mom, both of them beaming as he walked across the stage, diploma in hand, graduating with honors again. He'd done it. Finished college. The first person in his family to do so. After the ceremony, he told them both his news. He'd been accepted to graduate school for teaching, with a fellowship that would pay for everything. But first, he'd accepted a position as a teaching assistant at Roosevelt High. He'd be working there for a year before graduate school, helping in the English department. "You're coming back?" Mrs. Rivera asked, her eyes wide. "I'm coming home," David said. "I want to do what you did for me. I want to see the invisible kids, the ones sitting in the back corner thinking nobody notices them. I want to help them find their voices." Mrs. Rivera pulled him into a tight hug. "You're going to be an amazing teacher." That fall, David walked back into Roosevelt High, not as a student, but as a teaching assistant working with Mrs. Rivera. He was only 22, not that much older than the seniors, but he stood in front of those classrooms and he saw them, really saw them. And in the back left corner of one classroom, he spotted a boy, slouched in his seat, hood pulled up, eyes down, trying to be invisible. David knew that posture, that carefully cultivated disappearance. After class, David approached the boy's desk. "Hey, I'm Mr. Chen. I'm new here, working with Mrs. Rivera. What's your name?" The boy looked up, surprised someone was talking to him. "Kevin," he mumbled. "Nice to meet you, Kevin." David noticed the notebook on Kevin's desk, filled with doodles and what looked like song lyrics in the margins. "Do you write?" Kevin shrugged. "Not really. Just mess around sometimes. Can I tell you something?" David crouched down so he was at eye level. "I used to sit in this exact seat. Same corner, same posture. I thought if I was invisible, I'd be safe. But I was wrong." Kevin looked at him, really looked at him, surprise and maybe hope flickering in his eyes. "Being invisible isn't safety. It's just loneliness dressed up as protection. And you're not invisible, Kevin. I see you. Mrs. Rivera sees you, and I think you have something worth saying." David pulled a journal from his bag, brand new, leather-bound, just like the one Mrs. Rivera had given him years ago. "This is for you. Write in it. Whatever you want, whatever you need to say. You don't have to show anyone, but I hope you will." Kevin took the journal, holding it carefully like he couldn't quite believe it was his. "Why are you giving me this?"